In this third video of the Appreciation series, we will examine the string family of musical instruments. String instruments are defined as instruments that produce sound by either plucking the strings or bowing the strings. Typically, when we talk about the string family, we are talking about the instruments within an orchestra, which would include the violin, viola, cello, and string bass. It is also, of course, common for us to occasionally see harps used as part of the orchestra. When playing one of these string instruments, there are two ways to make a sound. If we pluck the string with our finger, we would call that pizzicato or P-I-Z-Z, pizz, for short. And that is simply the Italian term to pluck a string. Would we use the bow instead, then that would be called arco. Notice that to play on a violin, viola, cello, or bass with the bow does require the use of something known as rosin, and that is a dry, sticky substance that comes from the sap of trees. By applying the rosin on the bow, it would increase the friction between the bow hair and the strings, causing those strings to then in turn vibrate. Once again, we'll start from the smallest member and then work our way to the largest, which means our first instrument is the violin. In this picture, you can see the various parts of a string instrument. We, however, we're just going to focus on four main parts. The first would be the tailpiece, which is found at the bottom of the instrument, and its job is to hold the strings in place. Next, we would see the bridge, which is attached to the body, and without that bridge, the strings would not be able to vibrate since they're suspended in the air. Third, we see this black strip known as the fingerboard, and that obviously is where our left hand would place their fingers to change the pitch of each string. Like a guitar, we also see that there are pegs which are used to tune the instrument by tightening and loosening the strings until we have the desired sound. Here we see the open strings of the violin, that they have notes all the way from the G below middle C up till the top space of the staff. The violin is the most popular member of the orchestra. In fact, orchestras will typically have 30 violinists divided into first and second parts. Of those 30 violinists, the most skilled violinist is known as the concertmaster. They would enter before the conductor does and tune the orchestra. The viola, at first glance, does not look that much different than the violin. However, once you hear it, you then can understand the distinction. On average, a viola is typically 1/7 larger than the violin, and its sound is richer in comparison. The viola is the only member of the orchestra to read in what we consider alto clef, though as it reaches some higher notes, it may sometimes see the treble clef. The four strings that it has are somewhat similar to the violin in that they both share G, D, and A, but now it has a lower string known as the C string. For this reason, a viola is typically recommended for performers that like the idea of holding an instrument on their shoulder, but find the violin to be a little too high-pitched for their ears. Typically, there will be about 10 to 12 violas in an orchestra. Next, we see the cello. The cello actually has the same strings as the viola, but it's going to sound much lower and deeper. A cellist is always to sit down when playing the cello, and there is an end pin at the bottom for them to use to adjust it to their height. Cellos read bass clef, and there are typically 10 cellists in an orchestra. If I were to have a string quartet, that would be consisting of one cello, one viola, and two violins. Unfortunately, in a string quartet, there would be no double basses. Now, a double bass is known as that because it sounds 2 octaves lower than written. You can also hear the bass referred to as an upright bass, or string bass, or simply bass. Notice that a full-size bass is actually 6 feet tall, and for this reason, very rarely do we encounter a full-size bass in a school. In fact, a 3/4 size is much more common. It is very often that we play the bass without the bow, using pizzicato in place of arco. We will typically find 4 to 5 basses in an orchestra. Should we encounter a pedal harp, they are approximately the same height as a string bass. Their lowest strings are made of copper, their highest strings made of plastic nylon. If I wanted to change the pitch on a harp, I would do that by adjusting the pedals at the bottom bass. Each pedal corresponds to each letter of the musical alphabet. So if a song calls for C sharps, for example, I would move that pedal at the bottom to adjust the C strings on the harp. We are increasingly finding guitars used in orchestra programs. Guitars, unlike their orchestra counterparts, usually have 6 strings versus 4, and are often played with a plectrum or pick. There are many different types of guitars. Here in the graphic, we can see on the left an electric guitar, and on the right an acoustic guitar. In our next video, we will learn about the percussion family.